In a 1973 interview for Guitar Player, Ritchie Blackmore told Martin K. Webb, Jimmy used to run around telling everyone that he played on certain records. I asked him if he played on The Crying Game, that was Dave Berry, and My Baby Left Me. He said yes, I played guitar on that. What he didn't say was that he played rhythm guitar on it, because Big Jim Sullivan played the solo on The Crying Game. He was livid when he heard what Jimmy was running around saying because Jimmy had always used his guitar and everything. Jimmy played rhythm guitar because the lead guitar bit was a reading part and Jimmy couldn't read music. Well, both Jimmy Page and Ritchie Blackmore were session players in the early and mid-60s. Page was a successful session player. He played on songs for many great bands and artists. I mean, the list is huge. The Kinks, The Who, The Rolling Stones, German-born model, actress, and singer Nico, and many others, many others. By 1963, Blackmore began to work as a session player for Joe Meek's music productions and performed in several bands. He was initially a member of the instrumental band The Outlaws, who played in both studio recordings and live concerts, and like many bands of the era, used other names, such as the Rally Rounders and the Chaps, to secure multiple repeat gigs. Otherwise, in mainly studio recordings, he backed singer Glenda Collins, German-born pop singer Heinz, played on his top 10 hit Just Like Eddie and Beating of My Heart, and others. And in live concerts, he backed horror-themed singer Screaming Lord Sutch and Neil Christian. On his playing in Neil Christian's band after Jimmy Page left, Ritchie laughed and said that he played guitar with Chris, that's his real name, for about a year. According to Blackmore, Chris was a slightly bizarre person to work for. John Paul Jones, who was also a session player at the time, commented on Ritchie Blackmore in the interview to Steve Rosen in 1977. Blackmore is another guy I don't like. He was supposed to have been a big session man, but he must have done demos because he was never a regular session man. I'm getting out all my pet hates. That's pretty funny. So in the mid-60s in England, whenever a producer needed to book a musician to play guitar on a track, the call typically went out to one of two people, Big Jim or Little Jimmy. Jim Sullivan got his nickname Big Jim when Jimmy Page came into the session world. People called them Big Jim and Little Jim in order to differentiate one Jim from the other. The pop hit The Crying Game by Dave Berry, which reached number 5 in the UK in 1964, is one of many that featured both players, with Page handling the acoustic side and Sullivan taking the electric. After that first session, Sullivan and Page would go on to play together numerous times and became good buddies. A couple years later, when the label started incorporating brass and orchestral arrangements into recordings for popular music at the expense of guitars, Jimmy Page left his session work and joined the Yardbirds a couple years later. He formed his own band, Led Zeppelin, one of the greatest bands ever. Big Jim Sullivan recalls, the amount of recordings we did together was amazing. And when Jimmy said he and John Paul Jones were going to leave, I said, I should join them too. Well, Sullivan did not join the two members of Led Zeppelin. However, he did loan Jimmy Page a Gibson J200 acoustic that Jimmy used extensively on the first two Led Zeppelin albums. Ritchie Blackmore first met Jim Sullivan in 1958. He showed me another level of playing, Blackmore stated. He was probably the most advanced guitarist in the London area. So, Blackmore took lessons from Jim Sullivan, who had been playing guitar for 3 years. This is what Big Jim said about teaching Blackmore. Ritchie was a very precarious talent even then. He learned to be an individual very quickly. To be truthful, I think that telling him to be an individual and making him use his little finger is all I needed to tell him. The rest was natural to him. In 1973 interview for Guitar Player, Ritchie Blackmore revealed about having guitar lessons. I had classical lessons for a year. That helped because I learned how to use my little finger. A lot of blues guitarists play with only 3 fingers, and so they can't figure out certain runs that require the use of their little fingers. Classical training is good for that. So, Blackmore, Jimmy Page, and Jim Sullivan knew each other very well. Now let's figure out if Jimmy Page lied to Ritchie Blackmore about his session work with Big Jim Sullivan on Dave Barry's The Crying Game and My Baby Left Me. So, on The Crying Game, Jimmy Page played the acoustic rhythm guitar. The song is slow-tempo ballad with Sullivan providing echoing guitar licks behind Barry's soulful vocal delivery. Each lick is essentially a repeat of the previous vocal line, with the wah effect added to simulate the sound of a warble in someone's voice overcome with emotion. But on Dave Barry's My Baby Left Me, now Jimmy Page played the lead guitar while Big Jim played rhythm. It was during that session when Jim Sullivan first met Jimmy Page. This is what Jim Sullivan recalled about working with Page. I'll always remember the first time that I met Jimmy Page. We had a session at Decca Studios for Dave Barry. It was the session for My Baby Left Me. And Jimmy played lead guitar and I played rhythm. I remember the great solo that he did on that session. It is one of the best constructed rock solos on record. So Jimmy Page told Ritchie the truth about playing guitar on those 2 records. He played rhythm on The Crying Game and lead on My Baby Left Me. When Blackmore asked Page, "Did you play on those records?" Page replied, "Yeah, I played guitar." Why would Blackmore dispute anything he wasn't a part of? So Blackmore thought he exposed Jimmy Page, but he got it all wrong. According to Big Jim Sullivan himself, they worked together a lot, and he loved Jimmy's playing.